Good morning and welcome to the 18th meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2025. We have apologies today from Audrey Nicholl and Fulton McGregor, and we also have Michael Matheson attending for the initial agenda item, and he'll be attending remotely. So our first item of business is to decide whether to take items 5 and 6 in private. These are our review of the evidence heard today and our consideration of our approach to 2 members' bills. Are we agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. So our second item of, our actual first item of business is an oral evidence-taking session on an affirmative instrument, the Restitution Fund Scotland Order of 2025. And we're joined by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, and I also welcome to the meeting Avril Davison from the Police Division and Ruth Swanson, who is a solicitor with the Scottish Government. I refer members to paper 1 and intend to allow around 10 minutes for this evidence session. I'd like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make any opening remarks on this SSI.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, colleagues. This order revokes and replaces the original Restitution Fund Scotland Order 2021. Its purpose is to remove the Scottish Police Benevolent Fund as the operator of the Restitution Fund and to make provision for the Scottish Ministers to operate the fund. This order maintains provision for the administration of the fund, including making payments from the fund. The fund will be used to support services for police officers, police staff or any person assisting them in the course of their duties who have been victims of assault. Restitution orders are imposed by the courts in a similar way to fines. The money which is received from the restitution orders is paid into the restitution fund. The fund is ring-fenced for the purposes set out in the legislation. While police officers and police staff who are the victims of assault can currently access support services, for example, through police treatment centres or through Police Scotland's workplace provision of occupational health and employee assistance, the Restitution Fund makes additional funds available for valuable support services and is also available to any person assisting the police in support of their duties who is the victim of assault. We anticipate that the most likely victims of assault under Section 91 of the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012 will be police officers and custody officers. Support services can be any type of service or treatment which is intended to benefit the physical or mental health or well-being of the victim. There is no limit to the type of treatment or support that will be considered, and it could extend to the purchase of, say, specialist equipment or to funding adjustments where appropriate, or to provision of support services in a different location or setting. The main limitation of the fund is that it cannot be used to provide a direct payment to victims. Having ministers operate the fund does not introduce any barriers to the way the restitution fund will be operated, and the revised equality impact assessment concludes that the provision of this instrument does not discriminate in any significant way, and access to support from the fund is not impacted by any protected characteristic. No one should face abuse or violence while at work, and I believe that the restitution order sends a very clear message that if you assault our police officers or police staff, you will pay for your actions. And thank you, Convener, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I'm very grateful. I'll ask a straight question myself up front. The order came into force on the 10th of February 2021. In June of 2021, the Benevolent Fund withdrew from administering it. And in August of 2021, there is a letter which says no money can be paid out. This will not operate unless and until there is an alternative operator for the Benevolent Fund. We now fast forward to today, to the 4th of June 2025, and only now do we have legislation which puts an alternative in place which will allow everything to start moving. So why on earth have we had a 4-year delay?
Well, Convener, you're quite correct to say there is a history to this, and as you correctly referred to, my predecessor, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Veterans, did write to committee in August 2021 confirming that the Scottish Police Benevolent Fund had withdrawn, that they didn't want to operate the fund any further, and thereafter there were extensive discussions with the Scottish Police Federation, and they looked positive up until about the start of last year, and then I made the decision last year that in the absence of either the Scottish Police Benevolent Fund or the Scottish Police Federation being prepared to operate the fund, that it should fall to Scottish ministers, as I wanted to see this fund in operation. Restitution orders of course, are currently available to the courts, but I think it's fair to say that when the fund is operational, that will give us additional opportunities to appropriately raise awareness of the contribution that restitution orders can make to vital support, but also to support their use by our independent courts.
There has been a considerable delay, though, of 4 years. So it just begs a question. Has any data been collated? Has the Scottish Government got any data in on whether there are any individuals who have lost out as a result of the 4-year delay, who simply for administrative reasons will not have got what they should have been entitled to?
So the funds still rest in a ring-fenced account. There's a ring-fenced fund. There is data available. 103 restitution orders have been imposed by the court. I will be very frank, Convener, while that is a matter for the independent courts, I have asked my officials hopefully after the successful passing of this statutory instrument today, to engage with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service in an appropriate manner, of course, and we will obviously proceed with the establishment of the guidance and the application process, and to get the fund up and running for applications by April next year. So I'm very keen to make people aware of the benefits of restitution orders and to support the use of restitution orders, obviously in a way that's appropriate to my role and not stretching into any interfering with the independence of the courts in any way, but I would want to boost the funds that can go into the restitution fund so that they can be used appropriately.
Thank you. I'll move to questions from colleagues. I think Pauline McNeill would like to come in.
Thank you. Good morning. So we read, as you said there, Cabinet Secretary, it's a matter for the courts to decide. And we've heard there's been 103 orders, and that when they can either impose a fine or a restitution order, and I think what I've read, it should be broadly the same. If you're going to impose a fine, the restitution order would be broadly the same. Does that mean it's complete freedom of the courts to decide which they want to apply, or is there any guidance or criteria at all on when it should be used?
So it is a matter for the courts, as you would expect. My understanding is that the courts can use it separately or along with other orders, so that you could impose a fine and a restitution order. I think the great benefit of the restitution orders is that they not only support police officers and police staff who have been assaulted in the course of their duties, but also other people who have assisted the police in their duties who have been assaulted. So that could be other emergency workers, but it could also be civilians as well who've been assaulted whilst assisting the police. So there's a great benefit to the restitution orders. So they bring something additional to what's currently available to the courts.
Thank you. Well, I hadn't appreciated that there could be a restitution order and also a fine. So I haven't looked recently at what the kind of repayment figures look like for fines. I know in the past we've still got problems collecting fines. So you would think maybe a consideration is someone's ability to pay then, because if you impose a fine and you're thinking about a restitution order, then presumably that is some kind of self-imposing criteria, but whether there's the offender can afford that, and otherwise you're not going to get the return on it.
Yeah, I mean, and I suppose with any financial penalty, they can be paid in instalments, and there is an obligation on the court to consider the means of the offender, whether they would be able to afford to make a payment.
And maybe, is that possibly why there's only been 103 orders? To be honest, I think we're in a stronger position to encourage the use of restitution orders once the fund is up and running and there are people in place to administer the fund. I'm very keen to understand the data more and have certainly asked my officials in terms of Justice Analytical Services to liaise with, for example, the Crown Office for further data. And as I said earlier, I'm keen for my officials to engage appropriately with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service to raise awareness and to remind people of the existence of the restitution orders, which have been around, they have been used. I would want to encourage the continuous use and the expanded use, given the benefits of the restitution orders. All that hasn't happened is that any funds recouped from restitution orders, have not been administered to any charities for the benefits of victims of assault, and that's the purpose of today's instrument, is to get that fund established, get the guidance and get it operational by next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon Dowie.
It's in the same line of questions, Pauline, but it's just to explain the restitution fund a wee bit more. So the court can impose fines paid, and they're paid directly to the victim. So is the restitution fund in addition to that? So if the court imposed a fine, that would be paid directly to the victim, which would be a police officer?
No.
But the restitution fund's in addition to that? No.
No. So I think it's important to know, just for the record, that fines generally aren't paid direct to victims. So the fine income is in the first instance is rests with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service. It's part of their income that inflows throughout the year. I'll clarify with committee what happens with compensation orders, because that's another financial penalty. But in terms of restitution orders, any funds from restitution orders imposed by the courts goes into the restitution fund. It does not go direct to victims. So there's a fund available for organisations who support police staff, others, to be able to apply to a fund to support victims.
So it's a compensation order that would get paid to a victim?
I'm going to clarify that because I haven't, for the purposes of today, I haven't looked in close detail about how compensation orders currently work. But I know that fines, as a financial penalty, that the fine income does not go to victims.
Right. I think my question probably was, does the restitution order replace compensation orders?
No.
So would police not get a compensation order as the
No,
victim?
well, as I said to Ms McNeill, the court has all of these options in front of them. You know, whether it's custodial sentence, community payback order, financial penalty in terms of a fine, compensation order, and they currently have the option of a restitution order as well. And they can apply one or all of those options or a combination of those orders as they see fit.
Right, so police would still be entitled to a compensation order?
Sorry, victims.
Victims.
Yeah, which
Police,
could be a police
sorry,
officer.
As a victim.
So,
a victim.
so the court can use a fine, a compensation order, a restitution order, or a other community or custodial sentence with respect to any case as it sees fit, whether that is a member of the public or a police officer or emergency service staff.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Rona Mackay.
I'll be brief. Good morning. It was just, I'm wondering about the workload impact on the SCTS. I'm thinking it won't be huge, but has that been thought about?
Well, we always think about these things, but I don't think, I think I can confidently say that that's not a concern, because the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service already have to operate financial penalties, such as fines imposed and compensation orders, etc.
Yeah. And is there a timescale when this could be fully operational?
Aiming for April next year.
April next year. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Very grateful. Katie, would you like to come in?
I don't have any questions, thank you.
No? One final question from me, Cabinet Secretary. If this is passed today, only then, as I understand it, will the fund open up for applications, or the consideration of how it will open up for applications will start to be considered, and what the criteria are for those applications. So only at this point, 4 years after being originally put in place, are we now going to, assuming it passes today, start considering the criteria for applications? Which begs the question, why wasn't that done over the last 4 years? But perhaps more importantly, when will that consideration conclude?
So the end point that we're working towards is next April, so that there is a fund that applications can be made to. To be candid, I appreciate your frustration in this regard. I should say that there was a working group that involved Police Scotland, police staff associations, trade unions, and other charities like the police treatment centres. And there was certainly a broad consensus and consideration given to that, you know, you want any bureaucracy to be, you know, proportionate, that, you know, we don't want to be creating too many hoops or hurdles. Obviously, there needs to be a safeguarding of financial governance, but you know, that needs to be proportionate. So what will happen now is that we will continue that work, proceed with the guidance, the development of the guidance. We'll need to consult on that and obviously consider our work on the application process. But just to be clear, that I have seen an outline of the application process that takes us from, you know, the court imposing a restitution order on an offender right through to the distribution of funds and the victim receiving the relevant support.
I'm very grateful. Do any other colleagues have any questions? And if not, Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Convener. It was just to come back to check I've understood what you said, Cabinet Secretary, in relation to what the courts can do, because I do agree that there should be more encouragement to use them. But the note that we've got said that we anticipate that in a given situation, the level of financial and penalty imposed by the courts is likely to be the same regardless of whether it's a restitution order or another financial penalty such as a fine. and the financial impact on the offender and their family and any resulting impacts are therefore anticipated to be unchanged as a result of the implementation of a restitution order. So my reading of that is that if the courts were considering applying a restitution order, it wouldn't be in addition to a fine necessarily, so that wouldn't be a barrier. But I thought you'd said that they can impose both, or did you mean that they can impose both, but it shouldn't be higher than they would if they'd applied a fine?
So, and officials can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the 95 Act that sets out the procedures for financial penalties and the level of payment. So the maximum restitution order, in the same way that the maximum for a fine is £10,000, and that's an established procedure for the courts. And it's also my understanding that the courts would have the option of imposing a fine, restitution order, or another penalty, and that they could, if they wish, use a combination of penalties. Courts sometimes, I don't have the figures in front of me, but sometimes do fines plus compensation order. I don't know how common that is, but it's my understanding that the courts can use a combination of disposals.
So there could be a mix.
It could be a
right,
mix.
But am I right in saying, and this is quite important, I think, that the financial impact on the offender, so what we've got is that, in effect, the anticipated as a result of that shouldn't be higher than it would have been, albeit that a mix is being used. Just read that again. The financial impact on the offender and their family and any resulting impacts, therefore, are anticipated to be unchanged. So does that mean that even though you could use a fine and a restitution order or a compensation order, they're not three separate figures, and it would be, so in other words, it could be 3 times as much as it would have been applied had it only been a fine, and that together, if that's right, the overall amount wouldn't be high, because it does beg the question, if the courts can do that, if it means that the overall, if the cost is higher to the offender, it's going to impact on the ability to get that fine back.
So the courts under the legislation are under an obligation to consider the financial means and the ability of an offender to pay. Whether the, as I understand your question correctly,
it says it anticipated to be unchanged as a result of the implementation of the restitution.
So we're not. So we're not changing. So that this restitution order gives courts an additional option. We're not changing how they operate in terms of their consideration or their obligations to consider the impact on the offender to pay or their ability to pay. So we're not changing how any of that operates. This is an addition. Well, the order already exists. But there is a hierarchy of payments where the court imposes a combination of compensation orders, fine and restitution orders where they do not have the means. Priority is given to compensation orders and thereafter restitution orders, if that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our next item of business is to consider a motion to approve the affirmative SSI, on which we've just taken oral evidence. And in this, as it's a debate on a motion, only MSPs may speak and not officials. So can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S6M 17003 in her name and make any brief additional comments she may wish to make.
It moved, Convener, and I've nothing further to add.
Do members have any points that they wish to make? And if not, I invite the Cabinet Secretary to wind up and press or withdraw the motion.
Press.
So the question, members, is that motion or the S6M 17003, that the Criminal Justice Committee recommends that the Restitution Fund Scotland Order of 2025 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Are members content to delegate responsibility to myself and the clerks to approve a short factual report to the Parliament on the affirmative instrument? Great, that will be published shortly. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'll now take a short suspension to change over witnesses. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and the officials for the participation. Thank you. Just waiting for the TV to come back on. Yeah. So our next item of business this morning is to continue our inquiry into the harm caused by substance misuse in Scottish prisons. Today's session will give us the opportunity to take evidence from a panel of witnesses with experience of supporting people in prison and their families. This is a preparatory session to help shape our understanding of the key issues and inform the rest of our evidence taking. And I'm very pleased to welcome the following witnesses. Kevin Neary, the co-founder and coordinator of Aid and Abet. Dr. Sarah Rogers, the Senior Policy and Public Affairs Officer of Families Outside. Professor Susanna Gallia-Singer, Clinical Lead and Consultant Psychiatrist of NHS Fife Addiction Services. Gemma Muir, Senior Manager at Cisco. And Tracy McFall, Chief Executive Officer, Scottish Recovery Consortium. You are all very welcome this morning. I refer members to papers 2 and 3 and thank the witnesses who have provided us with written submissions in advance. I intend to allow around 2 hours for this session. I'll commence the session just by putting a pretty open question which I'll give each of you the opportunity to respond to. Starting with Kevin Neary. Kevin, what are some of the impacts of people using substances in prison, either on those using the substances and or their families and or other prisoners?
Thanks, Cavino. Thanks for having us along. You know, the impact, affects whether it be mental, physical, health, well-being. For the person using substances within prison is very high risk because of the nature of substance use that's in prisons today. That comes at different levels of strength, so there's a high risk to the individual using it. The impact on family, for instance, is drugs need to be paid for, and there's a financial element to that, and who's paying for that, and that can be the financial side to a family who maybe have to cover bills and costs. The psychological point to that is with families who have a loved one who is in prison with mental health issues, substance use issues, and that unsurety are they going to get a phone call? So the anxiety that's caused through that as well. So, you know, the impact is big, in whether it be mental, physical, or you know, emotional impact through the use of substances.
I'm very grateful. Dr. Sarah Rogers.
Thank you. And I think to say, firstly, we're really pleased that the inquiry is recognising from the outset that the harms that are caused by substance use in prisons actually does extend beyond the prison walls and does extend to families. Quite often the experiences of families are overlooked, so it's encouraging to see this built in from the start. So in terms of impact, well, imprisonment in and of itself has significant impacts for families, and I won't go into huge detail about that just now, but there's a range of challenges in terms of financial impact, you know, housing, physical, mental health impacts for families, and stigma. And for children, we know that imprisonment of a household member is an adverse childhood experience, and that this particular ACE is associated with a fivefold increase in exposure to other ACEs. And then, of course, having somebody in the household who uses substances is also another ACE. So we can see we've got two there from the outset. So when there's imprisonment and then there's also somebody using substances, it can compound these impacts, but there can also be additional specific to the substance use. So what we see is there can be significant impacts in terms of contact and specifically visiting with the person in prison. So there's a lot of research that really shows the importance of maintaining that meaningful contact between families and people in prison. It can support the health and well-being of everyone involved, and it can support desistance from offending. And we see commitments to that across Scottish Government policy, across SPS policy. So everybody is recognising the importance of family contact, but we are hearing quite regularly from families that, excuse me, instances where visits are being cancelled, and in effect it's as a punishment for substance use in prison. Now, loss of visits shouldn't be used as a punishment unless the visits were being used to commit an offence. And this has been the SPS policy for a number of years now, but what we are seeing in practice is that some prisons have started to revert back to that sort of punitive approach. So we've got a number of examples that we've heard just recently of families turning up to establishments, often with young children, and they're just told when they're in the waiting room the visit's been cancelled. No explanation is then given, and they have to wait to hear from the person in prison. And that individual's then letting them know that it's been because that they have been found to have taken or to have had in their possession substances. So families obviously find this very upsetting, children in particular, and there's significant implications because they've often travelled, you know, distances, they've paid money, and that, you know, they're not given notice. If we're looking at children's visits specifically, that's another sort of key impact that we're seeing. So children's visits, we're hearing quite regularly that they are being cancelled, that privilege of children's visits is being removed as a punishment where the individual in custody has been found to have used or to have possession of substances. This is obviously very upsetting for the person in prison, but for the children themselves, and they are in effect actually being punished, you know, for something that they've not done, and it's been hugely distressing. I think what's really important to consider in this regard is that we now have, in terms of children's visits, we have had the incorporation of the UNCRC, so children have a right to maintain contact with the parent in prison, and criminal justice agencies, including the SPS, need to be considering children's rights when they're making decisions. And what we're finding is that quite often that decision to remove the visits has been taken and there's been no consideration given to what impact that has on the child and to the right to maintain contact. Another aspect that we're seeing an impact for families is the visiting processes. So they're sort of telling us that there's a feeling amongst them that there's a sort of security theatre approach when it comes to substance misuse in prison. They feel that there's a strong assumption coming from prison staff that families are one of the main ways that drugs are coming into prison, and they feel that there's this assumption that they are at the visit doing something wrong or that they're going to do something wrong. And one family member spoke to us just recently about having been searched prior to coming to the visit, but then being told they couldn't hold their partner's hands because of security restrictions. So families are telling us that the way that they're being treated, the way they're being communicated with, makes them feel as if they're guilty of doing something wrong or trying to do something wrong. And they're questioning to us to what extent that assumption that drugs are coming in via families is actually backed up by the evidence. So all of this is making visiting very stressful for families. Just a couple of other sort of key impacts, and I think Kevin touched upon them, is the stress and the worry that is caused to family members. So having a family member in prison is stressful anyway, and concern for the person in prison is one of the top reasons that families come to us for support. So when there's then substance issues there, then that stress is really exacerbated. And families have sort of spoken about the stress when they might have a suspicion, has a family member maybe taken something, and they can't really tell from a telephone call, and then they're left with that sort of worry and that constant suspicion. And they've said that can have a real impact and take a toll on the relationship they have with that family member. The last impact, which again Kevin touched upon, is the financial impacts. So families have said that they can feel coerced, or they can be in some situations blackmailed into sending money to the person in prison's account or to unknown bank accounts. And they tell us they are hugely worried that when they're sending that money in, is it being used to pay for drugs? But they also feel that they're unable to stop paying that money in. Another issue relating to finances is that we've seen an increase in families that we support being told that property that they've handed in or actually had posted directly, sometimes from sort of online retailers, that there's been traces of drugs. Now, these items are of course not being passed on, but families aren't then being given sort of any communication about this. So they're being left out of pocket and they're worrying about potential legal implications, and then they're reporting there's no legal follow-up and they're never seeing the items again. And the final sort of financial impact is that during COVID, we saw prison policy meant that items couldn't be handed in. Families were having to post items in, a huge cost. After COVID, prisons did go back to allowing items to be handed in. But when there is something ongoing in a prison where they're having, particular increase in drugs coming in, they will sometimes go back to this sort of posting things in without the recognition of the financial impacts that it has on families. And often families aren't really told the rationale for these decisions. So they are more or less the key impacts on families.
I'm very grateful. Professor Galia Singer.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for having us here. So just to answer the question around impact, I consider the question in sort of 3 different phases. So one of them is the immediate impact. So at the point where the individual is going into prison, there's impact during the course of imprisonment, and there is also impact during the period of release. And we know that substance use, whether it's in prison or in the community outside of prison, has a ripple effect. And it has a ripple effect on the immediate significant others, but also on the wider society. So when we're thinking of the prisoner just going in, there would be fear, am I going to get the treatment that I've been having in the community? Am I going to be treated in the same way? Will I be withdrawing? So there's those fears that come to mind for the prisoner. And, they're going into a little bit of an unknown situation. And we know that there's a number of prisons across Scotland, and they don't all function in a similar way. So you might go to one prison and you'd be okay to get your treatment that you were having in the community, but you might go to another prison and there's a little bit of a delay for you to actually get the treatment that you were having in the community. So there's that fear and there's that unknown factor there. If you look at that and consider usually all people who use drugs, and, maybe not all of them, but the majority, have been subject to a lot of trauma. And often, if they've also committed a crime, then it's more likely that they've been subject to trauma. All the studies tell us that. So what we know is that they've got that PTSD, that post-traumatic stress disorder, that's going to affect that immediate impact that they would have as they go into prison. There could be medical emergencies as well. So I know that there's the Morse approach with people with substance abuse, where prison officers can monitor and can support individuals that are coming into prison with substance use problems. But that could mean that because they're withdrawing, because they have a significant problem with alcohol, that they might have a seizure because of the potency of the drugs that are out there, that they could be hallucinating. So there's a number of clinical, medical issues that could be there at that point of admission into prison. So I think although there is a system in place, but is it an effective enough system if we're having to transfer people from the prison to the hospital, for example, because of medical emergencies. So that's the immediate impact. The impact during the course of imprisonment. So there's a number of initiatives that are recovery-based, but is there enough of them? And from talking to different people working in different prisons, there's not enough of them. So in reality, are you actually providing a good recovery culture within the prison environment? And so often when you talk to prisoners, they'll tell you that they've been subject to bullying, they've been subject to pressure to be part of gang-like cultures around use of substances, and if they don't, they will suffer, or their families will suffer. So it's an issue that we cannot ignore. I think there's an issue around the culture in prison environments that people are subjected to. And we do know that even those who perhaps had not been using substances prior to going into prison are also likely to start using substances whilst in prisons. And there's a number of reasons for that, and I won't go into it now, but one of them is to do with lockup times. There's lengthy lockup times for prisoners. The other aspect, which is to do with the impact at the time of release, I think it's brilliant that there's been this national early release program that's been implemented. But it does pose problems that because of the early release, sometimes you're not sure that whether you're going to be released or not. And so there isn't enough time to make arrangements with community treatment so that there is a seamless transition from prison treatment into community treatment. So there's a lot of improvements that have been done around that, but there's still some problems over there. With regards to the families, it's been mentioned already, so all I'll say is that sometimes it's not just worry and pain, but it's also a sense of relief and guilt because families are burnt out. And so we need to support these families, at the different stages of beginning, in the course and at the end, because there's also worries around the fact that, say, if the son that's now imprisoned and is going to be released was abusing that mother at point of release, there's that fear, there's that, so we need to be supporting families. And I understand there's a upside, I think it's called now, that is to support families throughout the course of imprisonment. Children were mentioned, so I won't mention that again, but I'll just mention something around the impact on prison staff. So prison staff, and I'm referring not just to prison officers, but also NHS staff who work in prisons. And, we've heard earlier about, orders and things like that in place, but there's definitely increased prison numbers, which means increased workloads, increased stress, potential burnouts. Although there's been increased prison numbers, there's been increased capacity for prison officers, but not any increased capacity for NHS staff working in prisons. So if you're trying to provide treatment for a larger number of people, you're going to be stretched even more. So often they end up being subjected to coercion and corruption, and there's intimidation concerns that come into play. So I would recommend that there would be training for prison officers that would equip them with knowing how to handle situations, which would improve their satisfaction at work and less issues around burnout. Impact on other prisoners, I've mentioned the peer pressure and the environment. So some of our prisons are quite old spaces, let's put it this way, and they are not recovery they do not allow recovery focus to be properly implemented. So I would say we need to look at the environments as well. And I know there's been a lot of work around, ligature safety and things like that, but it's beyond that. It's not just about ligature safety. That's almost like a reactive approach. We want to think proactively. How do we make it a more positive recovery environment? Because after all, we need people to come out of there and just be able to integrate into the community and not feel stigmatized even more. So I'll stop there and I'll...
Very grateful. Gemma Muir.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you for having us. So the impact that substances have on any individual can impact both short and long-term cognitive functioning, memory, impairment, emotional instability, difficulties with executive functioning. It has a huge impact not only on their mental health but also their physical health also. And is there enough support from the NHS if it has physical impact, mental impact as well, isolation from families. So when you're using drugs, you completely withdraw from your families, and again that has a massive impact not only on the individual but on the family outside as well, causing stress and financial difficulties, which we've already spoke about. To buy substances you have to have money. This is putting exceptional pressure on the families outside, having to pay that for the individual inside. Yeah, thank you.
Very grateful. Tracy McFall.
Good morning. Thanks, Convener, and thanks for the invite for coming today. So my role here today is to make sure that SRC really get across the impact this has on people in recovery. So we've spoke to a range of people across Scotland, recovery communities, people with lived experience, people who are currently in prison and people who have recently been in prison. And we've also spoke to a range of leaders across the country who are currently managing small grassroots organisations who are in prison right now. So we have a job to do to make sure that the committee understands the massive impact this has individually and across society. So I'm not going to touch on a lot of what my other colleagues have said, but individually the impact, it keeps people entrenched in substance misuse behaviour. It keeps people entrenched in offending behaviour. There's a risk of harm in life. This is, I mean, we probably will touch drug deaths in prison. But there's a risk of harm in life in relation to this, impacts mental health, and it really, the people we spoke to, really creates mistrust in the system. Putting someone in prison, there's an expectation that there's care and support there. People don't feel that in prison right now for the people that we spoke to, and I think that's really, really important for the committee to hear. In relation to families, I won't touch on that because Sarah and other colleagues have touched on that a lot. But there's a broader thing for SRC in this. There was a few needs assessments carried out in 2022 in relation to the work in substance misuse, physical health needs assessment in prison, and it was very, very clear that substance misuse in prison should not be divorced from political and community policies. So whilst we talk about drug use in prison, it's really important to understand the impact this has on communities and the impact this has in the wider system. So if we don't start looking at this in a whole wider political policy landscape, if you think about hard edges, drugs, mental health, addiction, homelessness, domestic violence, and I would really urge the committee to look at this as widely as possible. This cannot be seen in isolation. And in relation to society and communities, before people even touch prison, we're talking about the most marginalised, vulnerable groups. People coming from deprived areas are 15 times more likely to use drugs. That's a massive increase in relation to whether those people will touch the justice system. So this is a massive impact on communities. And I think, Ms Dowie, I think you mentioned it last week at committee about the impact on the victims of crime. The people we are supporting in prison will go back to their communities, and that crime will potentially continue if we don't look at the intervention points across the system to try and intervene. So that's broadly where why here we're today, and I hope I've framed some of the impacts across not just individuals but in a broader sense.
I'm very grateful. That's extremely helpful to start us off. And just before I bring in Ben McPherson, I'd just like a small question just on something that you said, Dr. Rogers. You talked persuasively about when let's say families are going to prison and there's an issue if contact isn't allowed or children aren't allowed to interact properly with the prisoner. But on the flip side, the SPS presumably has to be ultra cautious about to try and prevent substances getting into prison in the first place. Do you have any thoughts on how that balance can be struck such that there isn't the negative that you outlined persuasively, but at the same time SPS is doing their job to the best of their ability?
Absolutely. Well, I think in terms of the removal of visits, so there's obviously situations where a visit is cancelled last minute because somebody is believed to be under, sort of the influence of a substance, and understandable. Nobody's expecting them to then be in the visit. In terms of children visits or visits that are cancelled when somebody's been found to have possession of drugs in prison, in that sense, we see it as in that is then being used as a punishment. That individual at that point, isn't presenting a risk. There's no reason, justification, other than it is being used as a punishment for removing the visits. In terms of the processes for people coming in to visit, we, of course, understand that, and families understand, there has to be very strict security measures. What families speak about is they feel that they are under suspicion. They feel that the processes that are in place, they're often not explained to them. And quite often, if it was explained, this is what's going to happen, this is the rationale for that, it could make it that bit more comfortable and that bit easier for them. Some of it as well, I think, comes from families really feel a lot of stigma when they're visiting, and there's that stigma simply from having a family member in prison, which is then compounded by if there's substance use as well, so that's sort of dual stigma. And families are telling us, and again, this is by no means consistent across the board, but quite often their interactions with the prison staff, they feel that they are treated quite poorly, and they do feel that they're stigmatised. So there's something there, again, there's not a quick fix, it's a cultural sort of issue, but that there could be something done there in terms of sort of staff training, just in the way that families are treated and spoken to. Can we explain processes to them and just try and make it, sort of as comfortable as possible for them without the need to, sort of negate any of the processes that absolutely have to be in place.
Very helpful and very grateful. Ben McPherson.
Thanks, Convener, and thank you to all on the panel for your time and participation this morning. Really interesting opening remarks from you all, and just to start building on some of the points you made, and I particularly Tracy McFall, what you said at the end of the opening remarks. One of the issues that we're of course probing is, what are the reasons why people use substances in prison? And I appreciate that's a broad question, but I wondered if there was more that you wanted to add about the reasons and contributing factors that are beyond the prison walls, so to speak, and also within the institution. It'd be good to hear your thoughts on both of that.
Trauma is not left at the prison gates. So trauma will follow an individual and their families into prison. So it's just to make that point really, really clear. And there's a number of other reasons that people use within prison, and that's based in research, and that's based in the needs assessments that have been taking place over the last few years. It's about the break from moving to community into prison. It's about the disconnection from family. It's about trauma. It's about the environment. It's about the people we speak to having no hope when they're put in prison. And it's a really sad indictment in relation to Scotland today, that people actually would prefer to go into prison and stay in the community. And I think that was raised last week at the committee also. Not seeing a future, being behind a cell wall 23 hours of the day. So there's all of those there's not one, and all of those will be seen in combination of a range of different things that people bring into prison. And for me and some of these people that we spoke to, it's a way to cope by using drugs. It helps the psychological pressures that people are put under. It helps with emotional regulation. It helps making sense of the situation that they're in. So this is not an easy fix. It's a very complex issue. And also there's bullying and intimidation. There's a range of different factors. And I suppose it's about us as a society and the committee to look at, well, what are the intervention points within prison that we can support people to start that journey, or to at least create a space where they can start to have some time where they can say, well, what's next for me? So I'll stop there, because I know Mr McPherson in relation to other people coming in, but it's a very complex issue. But the big thing for me is trauma does not stop at the gate. Trauma will follow someone into prison, and unless that's addressed in prison and as they come out of prison, we will still be in this position in a number of years' time.
And of course that's applicable in most cases to both people who've had challenges with addiction before going into prison and people who go into prison without necessarily a history of addiction, but are influenced by the environment.
The same, I mean, the research that I've looked at in preparation for this is the same applies, and I know that the committee will probably touch on that in relation to the numbers of people who have not used but start to use within prison. The same can apply for those.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to pick up on? Kevin? Can you...
Yeah, I would say that, you know, it's what Tracy says. Remembering that addiction's a behaviour, you know, and extreme behaviour. So anything done extremely is an addiction, and there's lots of many other addictions. And the solution to some of these is substance, but there might be other behaviours that that helps the coping strategy. Is what Tracy mentioned there. But when people are coming from community into prison settings and they're already going in with a drug issue, going into prisons, then it then becomes survival to get access to a substance, you know, and to use that, because when you're in that environment, there's a lot of pressure on. There's a lot of pressure on people trying to survive in there, and then there's even if you didn't want to use, you've not got a choice because if it's in the hall beside you, you know. So there's that. People who don't use substance, for instance, that go into prison and start using substances, they're all creatures of habit. You know, and people see other coping strategies and think I'll just start doing that. But actually, the people who suffer from addiction is people who came from a really difficult background. You know, not everybody who experiences childhood trauma or adversity ends up in the criminal justice system or substance use. But I can guarantee you, all those in prison with substance use did come from childhood adversity and trauma. And as Tracy says, it's untreated. And this is what it is. So it's untreated. It's always been untreated. You know, drugs are about stimulants as well. You know, there's a lot of people that now using stimulants and because of undiagnosed ADHD, you know, and has an opposite effect on them. So that's not looked at either. It's not being considered. You know, they have methadone as a substitute for opiate use in prisons, but they don't have anything for a stimulant. Actually, there is, you know, they use it in other countries in Shetland for those who are affected by ADHD. You know, so there's a lot of that going on in prisons, and to have recovery networks within prisons is an access to getting recovery within a prison, but then it's leaving prison and finding that pathway outside prison. You know, it takes, as I say, it's averaged, it takes you 3 years to transition from a new home into another home. You know what I mean? When you move home, and they expect people to do that in 24 hours. You know, coming from a prison environment into a community environment, which causes a high risk of relapse and overdose and sometimes premature death.
Colleagues are going to come in with considerations for outside, and which is of course absolutely vital. Just to pick up on some of those really helpful contributions, do you think that the overcrowding challenge, very serious challenge that we face at the moment, is a contributing factor to all of this? And does anyone else want to come in on the reasons?
Yeah, I do think so. I think, you know, when you've got overcrowding, you haven't got your personal space, enough time to just try and think about what you're going through. You've heard about trauma quite a lot. And it's just, you're being re-traumatized often if there's overcrowding, if there's poverty-like situations, if you're being subjected to bullying. So there's re-traumatization happening all of the time. And it's not just the overcrowding, it's also, I know with the there's been a reduction in working hours for SPS staff, rightly so, but that has meant that there's increased times of lockup for prisoners. And so that, together with the overcrowding, is going to affect. People get bored, people don't have enough activities. You're going to think more and more about your self-worth. You know, you've been traumatized, you think you're not worthy of anything, you want to numb yourself. And if you're in that situation, you're going to feel a failure and you feel you just want to just use more drugs to numb yourself. So I think there is a significant impact of overcrowding.
I'll come in as well, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, it has a significant impact on an individual. When we are looking at addiction, we have to cater to an individual's needs. Being trauma responsive, looking at the person, looking at the pain instead of looking at the addiction. And if there is overcrowding, then how can you possibly cater to every single individual's needs? They're not being met. Individuals use drugs to cope. It's to escape reality and to pass the time, boredom. Is there enough recovery initiatives? Are they getting enough free time? What is there in place exactly for all these individuals that are in prison right now? And there isn't enough. There isn't enough to cater to them and to help them with their mental health, physical health, addiction. You know, it's very, very complex.
Thank you all. Oh, sorry, Dr. Rogers.
Just sort of from the family's perspective, so as I said at the outset, we know that sort of meaningful contact is so important for the well-being of people in prison and their families. And that high prison population has a real impact on the time that is available for staff to support that contact, things like children's visits, the time that they have to provide opportunities for families to be involved in the care that their loved ones receiving, the time they have available to provide information for families, and the staff are just simply so stretched that they don't have the time to focus on these issues, and if they could focus on these issues, we would see benefits all round.
Thank you all. Back to you, Convener.
Thanks, Ben. Sharon Dowie.
Good morning. You've kind of touched on it in the submissions and in some of your previous responses there, but my question is the level of provision of programmes and supports for those who wish to address or manage their substance use in prison adequate for the number of people who wish to access these services? And is it available for all groups in prisons, including protection prisoners or those in segregation? And also in particular, and it was mentioned in the submission from SRC, what help is available if you're on remand as opposed to somebody who's been sentenced? I don't know, because it was the SRC submission, maybe start with Tracy McFall.
Yeah, there's a lot in that. Thank you. So the people that we spoke to in relation to the access to programmes and support clearly tell us, no, there is not enough available. And they would like more out-of-cell time, more access to recovery support, more access to programmes, more access to treatment in a range of different ways. So that was a very clear indication from the people that we spoke to. And there's a number of reasons that there seems to be a waiting list for programmes across the prison estate. And that would depend on the number of people applying for those programmes. It will depend on where you are in the prison. And we've also heard quite some interesting, we've actually had some interesting discussions, is that you could be in a programme, part of a programme, and then get transferred across the prison estate. And that might be for legitimate reasons in relation to prison numbers and pressure, but what that does is break relationships, break the trust, and potentially go into a prison that doesn't have that programme available. So there's a range of different elements in this, Ms Dowie, in relation to the people that we spoke to, but that was one that really stood out for us in relation to you could be part of a programme, you could be building relationships, you could be engaging with the prison staff really, really well, and you get moved to another prison who doesn't have that programme. What we know about addiction and what we know about changing people's behaviour, the opposite of addiction is connection. if you don't have relationships, if you think about how traumatised people are when they come into prison, it takes a long time for them to trust, it takes a long time for them to engage. But if we've spent time and effort and energy in relation to building those relationships, getting people into a programme, increasing their motivation and moving them across the prison estate, and that programme is no longer available the next day, that creates that mistrust in the system. So that's just I'm conscious of time, I'm conscious other colleagues will have loads to feed into this. So that for me was just some of the feedback that we got directly from people in prison and in the community just out of prison.
Okay.
Thank you. So in Cisco, we facilitate Recovery Cafe in Berlin and a School of Recovery programme, which is 6 weeks long. And this focuses on choices, behaviours, harm reductions, meeting the person where they're at instead of having an expectation that everyone should be abstinent, because that is not possible. So we cater to the individual's needs and we look at how we can support them and then give them that experience and knowledge to then take up on the outside. What Tracy was speaking about there, that some of our residents that have taken part in this has been transferred before they got to complete the 6-week programme, and that had a detrimental impact on them. These programmes are credited by Fife College, so not having that piece of paper, as we may think it is, but for them, it's hope. It's having something in their hand to say, I completed this. And, you know, it's not great, to be honest. In our Recovery Cafe, we have short-term, we have long-term, and we have those on remand as well. What we do here is that on remand do not get offered the same support as those sentenced. Also, if you're a high risk, you can be taken off of programmes as well. So again, we are punishing those who need help.
So do remand prisoners get offered to go in a course?
They can come to the School of Recovery and also the Recovery Cafe in Berlin.
Right.
But I'm unsure what else is offered to them, because there is many different programmes out there. So it has been something that has arisen in a Recovery Cafe, that if long term or those sentenced has been offered other programmes, the ones in remand have not.
And there's a lot of different programmes because you're having to cater for the individuals.
Yes.
So, right, yeah. Right, okay, thank you.
So if you think about NHS staff going into prisons, a typical day, they spend more than half of their day just giving out methadone or Buvidal to individuals, which is the treatment that generally people get given for opioid use disorders. There's very little time for them to actually be doing the real work, which is the trauma-informed approaches and trying to address the reasons why people use drugs. And so it can't all be done by NHS staff. So having third sector provision in there and having, I think there was a scheme for recovery officers as well that was put in place. It is fantastic because you need to have such staff. But once again, we're talking about the capacity is not enough. When you look at the need, the capacity that's provided to address that need is simply not enough. So I spoke to a recovery officer, and she was telling me that they had 3 prisoners with substance use problems who went through the recovery program with them. And because it was just 3, it wasn't perceived as a success by SPS. Yet these 3 people have not, 3 years down the line, have not gone back to prison. They're in treatment. They've rebuilt their relationships. As Tracy said, it's connectedness. Recovery is connectedness. So they've rebuilt their relationships with their kids and all that. So they're obviously success stories, but not perceived as success stories because there were only 3. And the reason why there were only 3 is because there were only 2 officers for a whole prison, recovery officers for a whole prison. And that's never going to work. When you look at the security measures, because you need to balance the security measures that you need to put in place. You can't afford to have big groups of 20 people going through, because the balance is not going to be right. So that's just one example of, why things are in place, but why they don't always seem to work. I mean, one thing that Scotland has been commended on internationally is the naloxone program. Mm-hmm. So there's, naloxone being given to prisoners, and also there's peer support to be able to teach people how to use naloxone. And so that's been commended internationally as it's a really good program. But there's other programs that could be put in place. And for example, one of them is not even sending the people to prison. Why is prison the option? Particularly if you know that the crimes that are being committed are related to substance use. And they're, to a degree, necessary crimes because they need to get the money, because they need to buy the drugs. So why is prison the best option? In New Zealand, so before I came here to Scotland, I was working in New Zealand, and we set up the alcohol and other drug courts. So they were run by 2 judges. I think there's a test of change happening in South Lanarkshire here. And it was amazing. These judges were trained. We trained them to provide support and to be trauma-informed. And actually, the majority of people who went there did not need to go to prison. There was 71% of them did not commit other crimes. And that's a significant number. And they just were engaged in treatment. So the treatment services, together with the courts, we were working together in order to just ensure that it's treatment provision as opposed to, a punishment or punitive approach. So I just mentioned a few examples just to give you an indication of, in terms of whether it's available for everyone. No, I think that's one of the points that I really wanted to mention today, the lack of consistency. It's inequity. There's no other way of saying it. It shouldn't be like that. And, those that are on remand do get less support as well. And there's also the risk of not linking them in with treatment services once they're ready to leave remand as well. So it's just there's a number of issues to look at.
You mentioned medication earlier on as well. Are you aware of issues of the medication that the prisoners receive in prison, being unable to get it when they're free?
Yes, so that has been an issue, although at the moment there's a number of schemes where it's being corrected. And I can give the example of NHS5, for example. So we've got, every 2 weeks, we have this meeting, which is called the Liberation Meeting. Mm-hmm. And so we meet up with prison officers, police, courts, and treatment services, including third sector. And we get information about individuals who are likely to be released over the next 2 weeks. And so we get information. We've got forms that get filled in around information of what they're on, how they've been in prison on that treatment, what else they might need. So we pick them up straight away as soon as they're released from prison. In the treatment sector, we've developed rapid access clinics, so we've created space so that you can easily see someone who's released today, this morning, been to court, and we can see them in the afternoon. So we've created a system that is seamless, but it's not everywhere, once again. So I can say what the experience in Fife is, mm-hmm. but it's not necessarily everywhere. In Fife, we also have Phoenix Futures going into prisons, so they're preparing them beforehand. Say they've started using substances in prisons, and they don't know about the treatment service. You need a sort of navigator to help you out, because you're not going to know where to go once you're released. You're also going to be a little bit unsure on whether you're going to be stigmatized, because a lot of treatment services stigmatize people with substance use problems. So you know, breaking the ice and helping the individual come into treatment. And we know that treatment works. So it's a really good approach. When people go into prisons, once again, depending on which prison you go to, there might be a delay on whether you're going to be started on medication or not. But again, we've seen improvement, so I don't want to be all negative about it. We've seen improvements. The awareness is there. We just need more staff to be able to do things.
Just a very brief point, and it's looking at sort of support from a broader perspective. So the SPS, the drug and alcohol strategy, actually notes within it the importance of family relationships and that meaningful connection. So we think we should also be looking at prioritising the support that is given for that connection and for family contact. It's not only about the sort of programmes of support for the individual.
Kevin, do you want to come in on this?
No, I would say that, you know, just back on the remand, for instance, I don't believe that remand get the same opportunities as convicted, and that seems to be an issue in most prisons, at HOD remand prisoners. And also what you've got is when they talk about groups and courses and stuff that are on for residents within prisons, if the staff is unavailable, then nobody's moving. And that's another hinder that comes in, which prevents movement. When you've got guys who are wanting to move through the system and getting to the top end, maybe a long-term sentence, for instance, and they need to go through courses and recovery journeys, and again, a waiting list comes up, their movement stops, and it keeps them there a year to 2 years longer than what was supposed to be, because they've not completed certain courses. So they'll say that there's courses there, the courses, and this is what the hoops you have to jump through to get to that, whether it be through your rehabilitation process or your substance use and how you're dealing with that. And if you're not meeting that, you can't move forward. So there's people held back for years in prisons. And also, just to highlight as well, because I'm very passionate about this, is people with criminal convictions are not treated in the community the same either. You know, because there's people being recalled back to prison for failing a drug test. People are getting recalled back to prison, going into their supervising officers and saying, which I encourage to be honest, because the treatment's here for you, MAT standards, it's all there for you, you should be entitled to this. I mean, they go in and be honest and say, I've had a lapse and I used a substance, they're apprehended and returned back to prison. I've got a guy down there I'm working with, but, you know, this is, so it's not just about what's happening in there, it's what's happening out here with guys who come out on licence conditions and that, and they call it a public health crisis, but it doesn't meet the needs of people with criminal convictions. They're not entitled to it. They're not treated like that. So there's a lot goes on within in that. The course has been there, and people not getting the opportunity to go on the courses to begin with. And then that then goes back into the impact of how that is on the families and everybody else on the outside. You know, there is a massive ripple effect within that. So just wanted to add that.
So I suppose I'm really keen just to keep reminding the committee that a lot of this has already been evidence. If you look at some of the HMIPS inspection reports around progression, so this is not new. These are things that we know already in the system, and I'm not sure if the committee's seen this, but the recent prisoner survey in relation to SPS, and that's individuals in prisons that's telling us about the impact of cancellation in programmes and not having access to programmes. So we're here because we're in it every day, and we've worked in the sector for probably hundreds of years between us. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is a lot of the stuff that we know that's the mark with the system, we already know. We really do. So I suppose there's a role for the committee here in relation to, well, we know this stuff, but what happens next? So a lot of this has already been well evidenced in relation to the issues around programmes and access to treatment in programmes. Ms Dowie, I hope that helps.
No, it does. In fact, your comment on the SPS survey, it said it recorded 240 respondents for drug support and 201 for alcohol support, wanted help but did not receive this prior to leaving custody. And I'm going to come back to the submission that you put in again as well, because it said that you'd put in that it basically help varies significantly depending on which establishment you're in. It's also mentioned about being transferred to a prison where there was no recovery support available. And not all prisons in Scotland have specific staff allocated to supporting and embedding a recovery-oriented approach. So I'm just wondering if there's any comments on, if you can say, why is this not happening? We already know it's an issue. It's such an issue that this committee has decided to do an inquiry into it. It's been brought up by the Scottish Parliamentary People's Panel. So I'm just interested to see, we already know what the issue is, so why is there such a range of services available in different prisons, and why do some seemingly not give any support at all?
Yeah, I wonder if I could come in a little bit on that, because there's a strategy. The SPS has a strategy on how to address alcohol and drug issues in prison. And if you've probably come across it, if you look at it, it's fantastic. It says the right things. But what it doesn't have is an implementation plan. And, you know, as you know, Tracy has said, we know all this. We've known all this for a number of years. It's about implementing it. And I think that is where we need to focus. We need to focus on an implementation plan which looks at whole of system approach. So it looks at the issue of use of alcohol and drugs as a whole of system problem. You know, it's stemming from poverty. Look at the social determinants of health, not just the end of the line, which is, you know, perhaps prison. So and address the issue more holistically. And we've got an example of that, which is the medication-assisted treatment standards that are fantastic. You know, Public Health Scotland just have been monitoring us on whether we've implemented medication-assisted treatment standards. And once again, you know, so the focus is on implementation. But how much have prisons been monitored for implementing medication-assisted treatment standards? And so, for me, we know a lot already, and it's really great that there's this inquiry, but let's get on with it.
Yeah. Get more action.
Yes.
Anybody else want to comment? No.
And a positive and glass half full kind of person, I suppose in a positive, the government have made investment from an SRC perspective to develop recovery communities, recovery capital, recovery activities across every single prison estate. It's 2 members of staff across the whole prison estate, and we need to remember there's cultures and systems and regimes when you go into prisons that can be really hard to navigate. So you will have governors who get recovery, and the door is open, and staff are involved, and there's cafes on a regular basis. You'll get other establishments that don't potentially understand recovery and have a different culture and a different way to work in relation to their treatment regimes. So there is work being done, and we're doing a baseline across every prison, and we're doing some evidence-based and evaluation in relation to this so we can get a proper sense of what's happening in Scotland. But it's not available to everybody that needs it, Ms Dowie.
So is the barrier the resources to do it, or are some of the barriers the culture, like you kind of get a recovery cafe into every single, so it's both?
It's both. It is both.
It's a big issue. I think, you know, the culture in prisons certainly is not trauma-informed. I think we need to just, in order to have a trauma-informed culture within prisons, you need to have training of prison officers, you know, because you're never going to have enough recovery officers for prison populations. But if you have each and every person working in prison with an understanding of what recovery means and why people are behaving in a certain way, and know what to do, because that's the other issue. Because a lot of the time stigma arises from the fact that, yes, you know something, but you don't know how to react to it. So you close up and become hard. And so, you know, if you give people skills on how to handle things, then you're going to get slowly. I mean, culture changes. It takes a long time to change, but slowly you'll change the culture within prisons, and so you'll have a more recovery-orientated approach, not just for people who use substances. You know, it's going to impact across the board.
Thank you. Before I bring in Pauline McNeill, I'm going to take a short supplementary from Rona Mackay, and I'll just ask quickly, Kevin Neary, what about, just on matters that you were discussing with Sharon Dowie, what about protected or segregated prisoners? Is there an issue with accessing programmes because you can't mix different types of prisoners?
Yeah, there will be. It depends again on each prison and how each prison is run, what courses are available within each prison state. But, you know, like protected, I don't believe that people in protection will have the exact same access as mainstream for different types of protection, so to speak. But it's about the staff levels, and do they have the staff ready to deliver that? But they certainly won't mix. You know, when I go into a prison, I'll speak to 3 or 4 different groups, because that's, you know, whether it be female population, whether it be mainstream population, whether it be young offenders. I'm talking about Pullman, for instance. You know, but there's different age groups and stuff in that there as well. But you know, I have met the protection group of people when it was through a mentoring role. It was no based on substances, it was more about a mentoring role that I saw a group of people in protection. But I don't believe that they get the same. I think it's just mainstream prisoners who will get the access. Remand prisoners and those on protection or whatever will not get the same care, so to speak, as the mainstream.
Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I just wanted to pick up on a point that Tracy made, and everyone seemed to agree about it. Well, you know what the problems, you all know what the problems are. They're long-standing. So I'm just keen to know, do you think it's partly an organisational problem? Obviously, more money always helps. But is there an element of agencies not working together to sort of secure pathways, and there's gaps in the system which could be cured by a better organisation? Tracy, do you want to?
I think it's a wee bit bigger than that. So if you look at the needs assessment again that was done within prisons, and there was some issues that were raised around the systems in which prisons operate in. So prisons don't really fit squarely into health and social care partnerships and community partnership structures, because we don't have a prison in every patch. Prisons have their own autonomy, which means things are different across Scotland depending on how the prison wants to operate. There's different cultures and complexities in relation to the stuff that we've talked about. And I think we need to be really clear about this. There's no parity. So you've got NHS, SPS and third sector, and then loads of recovery communities, loads of third sector grassroots organisations scrambling about in the prisons to try and support people. There's no equity in relation to some of that. The power, if excuse the phrase, but sits with the NHS boards and our SPS colleagues. There is no parity, and I'm sure, I mean, the committee's done a lot of this, but I've been involved in pre-budget scrutiny of these committees. We all understand the complexities coming across the horizon in relation to third sector funding, and that evidence is really, really clear. So there's something about the parity, so no wonder we don't get co-produced collaborative decision-making processes about how to change the system, because there's an imbalance in the system from the beginning. And I think there's a bigger, broader point. So I had a wee look, sorry, very briefly, I had a wee look at some of the things that have been happening across the sector since 2022. I uncovered 24 documents that are all pretty much saying the same thing. But on top of that, you've got the Audit Scotland report, the People's Panel report, the National Mission, the Sentencing Council, the MAT Standards, the McLeish Review. I even went back to the Christie Commission. And actually, if you look at the Christie Commission, I'm like, that's still relevant. So I suppose there's something bigger for me, Ms Mackay, in relation to this. This is not just about NHS. This is about strategic leadership in the government. This is about joining the dots at a national level. I think there's enough money in the system. I just don't think we're using it correctly.
But that was what I was trying to get at.
And if you go back to hard edges, mental health, justice, addictions, domestic violence, homelessness, siloed. So there's a role there for that integration, that health and social care partnership, who some of them don't have delegated responsibilities for justice, may I add, which makes it more complex. So it's a lot bigger than just the SPS.
Thank you.
Sorry,
thank you.
It's a hobby horse of mine, sorry.
I'll ask my questions later, but I'll let
course.
Pauline.
Thank you. Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Convener. Maybe I could just follow up what you said there, Tracy, which has been a running theme, which is we've got all these documents, all the strategies, lots of things we're doing really well. And we're not unusual in Scotland, because England has the same problem. The prison regime is completely overcrowded, is stressing out the staff who run it, and it's impacting on prisoners, and undoubtedly, therefore, impacting on the ability of both prisoners, who we know, according to the survey, most of which are not even getting out for more than an hour out of their cells, some of which are doubling up. I don't know what that looks like, but you know that's the regime we're operating in, so it's not easy. But I suppose my question then is, given what you said to Sharon Dowie about there's no consistency here, I mean, it's shocking that a prisoner who's opted to go on a programme is in recovery, and everybody wants that recovery, the community want that, the individual wants it, and they could be transferred to another prison. So does it not maybe beg the question, I'll ask this to you, Tracy, first, instead of all the endless documents, maybe it's time to have some categoric rights for prisoners to have that right to continue their rehabilitation or recovery. I'm sure other members are the same. I get lots of letters from prisoners writing to me, and it's about the waiting list for rehabilitation. They can't get on it, and they're saying, I want to do things to get into recovery. Do you think it's time to take a different approach, Tracy McFall?
I think if we don't take a different approach, we're going to be, and I've been in the sector for nearly 30 years, so if you hear some frustrations in my voice, it's not because I don't want to find a solution, it's because I've had these conversations for so long. But if we don't start to look at something different, if we don't start to free up space in the system, so I think there's a few choices for Scotland. Sentencers are completely independent, so we may not be able to do anything if they don't have confidence in community sentences. Yeah? So we may still send more people to prison. If we don't free up capacity and space within prisons to create space where we can rehabilitate people, the only other option is we get people when they come out to stop them going back in again. So we need to make a choice. Can we change the whole system? Are we able to in the current climate in relation to everything that's going on? But if we don't start to make some fundamental choices in relation to doing things differently, we're going to be in the exact same position. And I think there is some things we could do differently at an SPS level in relation to consistency and approach coming from headquarters in relation to how prison regimes operate. I do. But right now there doesn't seem to be a centralised approach to SPS saying to prisons, this is the bare minimum. These are the bare standards. These are the bare minimum that people must get when you come into your care. Well, should that be enshrined in rights? We've had the same debate about the rights to the Addiction and Recovery Bill. Just because it says that somebody's got access to human rights does not mean to say in practice that that's going to happen. So again, I think there's a bit of a debate that we have to have around that.
So you said in your submission that, so it's depending on what prison you end up in, are there specific prisons or is it so random? Are there specific prisons you could point to and say, well, if you get moved to that prison, you're not going to get that programme of recovery?
I can tell you what prisons are really good. I'd rather look at that kind of approach. So we work really close with HMP Grampian. They're an outlier. Go and visit HMP Grampian and the work they're doing around that PR2 process, prison to rehab. So they have got a really good, connected, cohesive partnership approach, and a governor who gets it.
So they're down to governors then?
There's something about leadership,
Right.
Miss McNeill, I'm not going to lie. It's like all of these things in terms of leadership, and sometimes what happens in prisons is the leader can go and move, and that changes the culture within prisons. So HMP Grampian is an absolutely fantastic example about how thinkings work, and that is that covers rural and remote as well, which is really interesting, and they still make it work. So I would suggest as a committee, so rather than saying what's not working, I would suggest that you look at the areas of good practice, and HMP Grampian is one.
Well, any information that any of the panel could provide then, I think, because we need to know where it's not working, I think, for the purposes of the reports. I think it would be really, really helpful. Could I ask about remand prisoners? Or you already mentioned it, but we've got a quarter, just about a quarter. So does that need to change? Because now, committee does understand the subtle and important difference between how you treat remand, because they are innocent until proven guilty, waiting on a trial, but a lot of them will either be on drugs, weren't on drugs when they went into prison, and some were. So you've got that combination. So do we need to change anything in relation to how remand prisoners get access to drug treatment?
When again, it's down to the courts, it's down to the fiscals, it's down to the Crown Office as well. But you know, people being remanded into custody, first of all, who don't use substance, then you go into custody. We all experienced lockdown. We knew what it was like. The increase of people who started drinking more alcohol who didn't normally do it. Divorce levels shot sky high. People separated because they were living in the same house with the person that they loved and found out a lot about each other. So you put two people in a cell together, It does take them a week or two to start finding out about each other and how that relationship goes, but also the pressures of that, and that's what leads to the substance. But there's people that spend, like, you know, there's people done like years in remand over a period of time where they could, through doing community stuff and keeping people out of remand, but actually dealing with their issues in the community even before sentencing. You know, that's about bringing reduction down as well. The overcrowding came at they should have seen it coming over the hill, because when they changed the criteria, you do 2/3 or a half of your sentence, and they stopped all that. They knew the prisons were going to be overcrowding. It was coming. It was already written down before they even got there. In 2018, I think that happened, and then where prisons became overcrowded, and it was never looked at. You know, but with the remand population who don't, you need to actually work out why they've been remanded in custody. Do they really, I mean, if it's to protect society or if it's to protect a court case and that, I get it, but there's people in remand today that shouldn't really be on remand for the crimes that they're in for. You know what I mean? And if they had to look at the social inquiry or background reports, as soon as they see drug addiction, mental health, and that report should have then the courts there should be making a decision if that person should go to prison or not. Because, you know, sometimes people are maybe needing more hospital care than prison care. And I think that's a big one in this country. You know, the worst than for remand prisoners. You know.
Thank you. Sarah Rogers?
I don't think we would sort of be saying anything specifically in relation to how people in prison are treated, you know, sort of on remand, but just to come in terms of the issues that you'd said about that sort of culture and that consistency, just to say that that really does extend to families, and it very much comes down to the individual establishments, what their experience is in terms of how families are supported and contact is supported.
Thank you. Professor Gallagher, do you want to add?
Yeah, so there is a difference between people who are on remand and those who aren't. I think the provision for people on remand is much less. But once again, I think we need to think about alternatives to remand. You know, do they need to be in prisons? Do they need to be locked up? You know, if the main issue is to do with substance use, then why don't we try our utmost to put them into treatment? You know, there's drug treatment and testing orders. There's a number of things we can think of. You know, the drug courts that I mentioned earlier. I think it's really important that we start thinking along those lines. Is remand or long-term sentences, are they the solution to the problem that we're facing?
Thank you. I don't know if you want to answer it, Gemma, but if I can just add, what I'm interested in is, and I take the point that's been made about, but we're clearly locking too many people up on remand if we've got a quarter in prison, but while they are there, they don't seem to get access to the same treatment. Now, you can understand there are some legal aspects of how you treat remand prisoners, but when it comes to support, if they've either started taking drugs while they're in jail, which we know is high enough, or they were, surely there should be no distinction then between prisoners and remand prisoners, or what do you think?
I think that it could be the first-time offence. A great breed of uncertainty from anyone on remand. How long is it they are on remand for? Is it 180 days?
Well, it could be longer than that, depending on when their case goes to court. So,
and whoever their co-pilot is as well. Now, if they are using substances, then it's a possibility that they will also use substances as well. But I think just a great deal of uncertainty. If you have a mental illness, where is that one-to-one support coming from? Is there mental health support? Is it active right now? And the lack of support, the lack of groups supporting an addiction, supporting these men while they are in prison it's not great at all.
Thank you.
Could I just come in just to make the committee aware? I think it's also important to raise for the people who get released straight from court. So just very, very quickly, but this is something I received last week. 59-year-old man, released from court, issues of trauma, homelessness. Before release, he did get support from a prison-based housing officer. They had a coordinated plan. They told him to go to the housing office. He went to the housing office. They didn't know he was coming. The worker suggested to go and stay in a couch or stay with a friend. The next day he returned at 3 o'clock and they told him there's a hotel space if he'd like it. He couldn't stay in the hotel, so he couldn't stay in the B&B. So that night, he'd also, because he'd been left straight from court, all his belongings were still in prison. He went to get belongings the next day. SPS couldn't find his belongings. So you imagine, just imagine how that feels about being released from court, didn't know you were getting released, thought you had a housing appointment, went to the house and who are you? He's now homeless. He's now got trauma and everything associated with that. That was 2 weeks ago. This isn't a topic that's 6 months old. This is happening right now. So I suppose I'm just trying to contextualise that this is real people's lives and real incidents, real scenarios that people are going through right now. And I just really
no, I'm glad you add that in, because I have that exact case in Glasgow right now.
And I could give you another.
A mother who's written to me, and she knows that if her son is released, and he might still be remanded, but if he is bailed, she's pointing out the obvious, what she's just said, is which that there's going to be a vicious cycle here, and we've very little chance, or far less chance, of getting this person into recovery because of all those things. So appreciate that.
Just like it last year, and it was through the prison. The sister of the guy was on the phone to us to get him support because he'd been bailed but still on remand due to GDPR. Prison couldn't disclose his name and all that stuff, whatever. But what she was saying is he's 21 days clean, Kev. And if he gets out, he'll overdose and he'll die. So we tried to get to him. Prison was only doing what their policies and procedures tell him to do through GDPR and refused to give us that name. And the story to that was he did get, we missed him, we lost him. He was, none of the service was there to pick him up, and it was 10 days later he was dead. You know, and that was a homelessness and all the other stuff Tracy just spoke about there that falls along with that. And this is happening a lot out there, you know, with people getting let down. Not just to get let down in the prison sentence or the remand time or your prison sentence time, but then when you're coming back into the community, the lack of communication and lack of support is there, and this is where people then, they're part of that revolving door, or back in prison, or coming out here. As I say, you know, in that inside of the wall, you know, a lot of things have changed in prisons. But this side of the wall, it's got worse, and it's harder for people to live out here, and sometimes people see that prison's probably the safer place for them. You know, and that's a sad place to be as well.
I'm just coming in that, if possible. So if there's no coping strategies in prison for being liberated back into the community, then when we speak to individuals and we say, where are you going to be housed? And they say, I don't know. And this could be a week prior to release, or it could be days prior to release. Again, uncertainty, stress, not having a secure accommodation in place, and what environment will this person be put into? It already causes a great deal of stress. And what they're thinking in that moment is, I'm going to come back. So again, it's that revolving door, because prison is what they know. They know what to expect in prison. They don't know what to expect on the outside. Homelessness is a massive issue. Being put in hostels, again, surrounded by drugs in an environment that you don't know and you're unaware of, creates fear. Not having benefits sorted because you've no ID. GPs. I don't know how many. I work with men who cannot read or write. Now, they don't get taught that in prison. So if they're coming out, they're receiving texts on their phones and they can't read them. They miss appointments. And if they don't have a doctor's, how are they supposed to register with a doctor with no adequate support or help? When this happens to this person through all this complex, what they want to do is go back to what they know. So they want to reoffend. And that's so wrong.
Can I just say as well, just to give you an idea, when you're in prison and your breakfast, lunch and dinner's provided every day for you, your accommodation's there, you've no rent, gas or electricity, utility bills, no council tax, you've got none of that. All the pressures of life is taken away from you, which then gives you space, gives you mind space, and that's where opportunity for learning and rehabilitation happens, you know. But then when you're released from prison, and you need to find that breakfast, lunch and dinner and that accommodation, and actually realise you've got that bills to pay and you've got everything else all coming on top of you within 12 hours. That's a lot of stress in people's lives, and if they're not get that support, and even the transitional period coming from prison life back into the community again, they're no teaching guys or bringing them awareness that actually what you're going to experience is normal. You're going to experience loss to connection, to community, because that's what you had in prison. You're going to lose all that. You're going into isolation. It's not right to feel like that. You know, they don't build it up. The sense of loss, the sense of separation, structure, everything's taken out of their lives, and they're put into the, if they're lucky enough to go into accommodation, you know, they're still going through that process. It's a grieving process. You know, when you leave any environment and you move into another environment, there's a sense of loss and separation. If they've got chance, if they went in and educated men and women in prison to this is the journey. It's normal how you go through this. And educated people and have the support, you know, then we'd have less people going back to jail. But when the stress comes upon you, you want to subdue that emotional pain. You go back to what you know, and you're back at the revolving door again, if you're lucky.
Very grateful. I'll just bring in Ben McPherson on this exact point before I go to Ronan Mackay.
Thanks, Convener. I wanted to come in just now because I was curious to ask, we've talked about the lack of consistency inside prisons for rehabilitation and support. All that you've just said, and I've had cases from my constituents that are similarly very concerning in terms of when people are released or bailed. I feel like for years we've been talking about a lack of consistency in terms of the support when people are released or bailed and the connection. What do you think we need to do to create that consistency, to create that collaboration, to create that coherence when it comes to NHS and GPs, housing and local authorities, Social Security Scotland and the DWP, third sector support, and including what many of you are doing? How do we create that consistency and that comprehensive package of what people need when they're bailed or released? Because from everything you've said and from what I've heard previously and what others have heard and what's been analysed and what's been published, it seems so key, not just for helping the people that it's affecting, and of course that's the most important aspect of this, but also for dealing with the issues of overcrowding and changing the position that we're in Scotland with the amount of people that we have that are incarcerated.
I can try to answer that. So I think the first thing we need to do is own it. Own it as an issue, all of us, because we keep waiting on each other to do something about it. And I think if we see it as this is our problem, this is a social issue that we're not addressing properly, then we start wanting to do something about it. So the key there in what you've mentioned is collaboration. And it was mentioned earlier around silo working. There's so much silo working, and we do that so much, where we put an organisation in, but it's not connected with the other organisation.
Does somebody need to hold that coherence, though?
Yes, somebody needs to hold that.
Drive it.
And Tracy mentioned the leadership. So there needs to be somebody who takes the leadership, drives it, and connects us together, so that we know what we're doing. Because it's a big problem. You know, there's more prisoners with substance use problems than prisoners without substance use problems. So it's a significant issue. So unless we actually have somebody who will have a shared vision, we need to have a shared vision that we all own, but we need somebody to take a little bit of leadership, not to do everything themselves, but to help each and every organisation to work better together, to build those bridges together. Because I think unless we do that, we're not going to get anywhere. And we saw with COVID that when we worked together, we found solutions. And often we don't work together. We work within our silos. Then one thing that was mentioned earlier about the GPs, so thank you for mentioning that. I mean, it's such a quick win. You know that somebody's going to be released. So why is there no preparatory work to get them registered with a GP prior to release? You know, it's a quick win. It's an easy thing to solve, but it doesn't get done. So what happens is when they get released, they've got no connection with a GP. It's difficult to get them registered because GP practices are also full. So if that work gets done beforehand, then it's one problem less. And I saw someone about 2 weeks ago who had substance use problems and a history of mental illness. And I'm talking psychosis, I'm not just talking depression or anxiety. The medication was not continued. So the antipsychotic medication was not continued. So she's severely psychotic, needed admission to hospital, to the mental health unit. It's, something that could have been prevented if a GP would have been on board beforehand and the medication would have continued. So I think we need to work together to be able to get there.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in?
I would probably go a little bit further.
Please.
There's no surprise there. I suppose for me there is a couple of key partners in this, and that's the NHS and SPS. So the question for me is particularly around SPS, and I am not about criticising SPS colleagues or NHS colleagues because I understand how hard we are all working on the ground. But there's something around the central leadership around not having consistency across SPS establishments. I don't understand how difficult it is to make that happen, because because every prison operates differently. There's nothing in the legislation rules to say that that should be the case. So I don't understand why, from an SPS perspective, we couldn't look at a helicopter view about this is the minimum standards we want across every SPS estate. Get it done. There will be resources required, I'm sure. But for me, I would go slightly further, because I think we have talked about collaboration, we have talked about the role of health and social care partnerships, but actually for me it's getting more serious now. I think we really need to take, and I think the Scottish Government, I think this committee's got a real role in that, to really start putting our NHS board and SPS colleagues, I wouldn't say under a bit of pressure, but to really ask them questions about what would it take to get consistency across the prison estate in relation to access to treatment programmes.
So that's within, but in terms of when people are on being released or bailed, how do we get that more consistent?
Well, for me, am I okay to come in? That's my hobby horse again. So for me, I'm going to go back to the data question, because right now there's massive data gaps in relation to Scotland. So how we commission services as people leave prison, how areas are commissioned services in relation to the data and the needs of those populations is currently not known. And it's very, very clear. You look at every report we've talked about, every needs assessment, we don't have the data that we need across a range of different prison systems and estates, and when they come into community, how will those connect. So there's a number of different NHS systems, and that's in the prison without being connected to the SPS prison systems without moving it, before you even move into the community. So there's a question for me, Mr McPherson, in relation to understanding what the needs are, but then commissioning the services based on local need. And that's when our NHS and our ADPs and Community Justice Partnership colleagues are going to have to come into play, because we need to commission things differently. If we're talking about human rights-based, we keep talking about human rights-based, trauma-informed, person-centred approach. I don't even know what that means. So we need to look at how we commission services differently as people come out of prison.
So appreciating that in terms of everyone's got their individual needs and we want to take a person-centred approach, and appreciating that there will be local differences, particularly with regard to geography, demography, third sector provision. But is there a more generic set of minimum requirements that needs to be either enhanced or further agreed, to make sure that we don't have a situation where somebody's leaving and they're going into a temporary accommodation, or they're leaving and not able to access the drugs that they've been able to use in prison, the prescriptive drugs for a condition, where there's not the connection that's required. I've got an awareness of what local authorities do, for example, and what partnerships do where I represent, but is there a greater need for consistency across the country?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the liberation meetings that we set up in Fife. And they have really worked, because we used to have that problem that suddenly on a Friday, you know, suddenly you have to just find a way of getting a prescription done, and it's that inconsistency that there's no, you know, housing security and things like that. So with this meeting, we've got a number of stakeholders at the meeting, including housing, including SPS, including the police, NHS, third sector, and the reason why it was set up, I mentioned ownership earlier. It's because the Fife Alcohol and Drug Partnership, which is part of the Health and Social Care Partnership, has owned it and has recognised this as an issue. And so we've put this meeting together to be prepared for the individuals. So housing is arranged beforehand. So links with GPs are generally arranged beforehand. And so you get that preparatory work done. So that is, I would say, a good example of a way forward with it, which is not a complex, it's not rocket science, it's not a complex approach, but it doesn't happen in every region.
I guess the challenge is going from generally to always. Thank you.
With respect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just to Tracy's point earlier, just from what we've been talking about there, about the lack of parity between organisations, I think is absolutely key to what we're talking about. And you're saying it can happen if, you know, it can work. There are some success stories. Before I go on to my other question, I wanted to pick up with Kevin. You've been doing excellent work with ex-offenders for years. Do you think things are getting worse from all the years you've been doing that?
Yes, absolutely worse, and it's scary. It's fearful. It's the drug trend has changed from when I was in prison. You know, and you find that, you know, that heroin is in prisons, but not as much as what it used to be, because there's other ways it's happening. Security's changed as well, so it is getting a lot worse over now, and it's why we need to really be doing something more about it, because it's not looking good. How it's happening. And just on the other questions there, when we look about, Tracy mentioned earlier about the key to relationships, and I get a sense that within the prisons and NHS, the relationships are not as good as what it might come across, and that's possibly what's needed more, is the relationships between SPS, NHS, third sector organisations, you know, to really enhance and get the support. And actually, what can we do to stop sending people to prison with mental health issues, or committing crimes that are drug related because it was through to their drug addiction, especially the female population as well, you know, who are getting sent. Some of these girls have went through the most horrific experiences in their childhood and end up with so much emotional pain, they end up in addiction and have to do and have actually employments which they have to find money to subdue their emotional pain and the misery they've been set through, and then they get sent to prison for shoplifting, for trying to get money to get drugs to subdue emotional pain. It's not been treated. Do you know what I mean? And this is what we've got as well.
So you've actually just come on to my points that I was going to raise, exactly that. Just for context, though, before I go on to that, Lomos is in my constituency, and they have a recovery cafe on site, and it can see 200 prisoners engage in any given week. But they say there are pathways for external referral, but a lack of available spaces. So we're back to, you know, it's kind of working, but we can't do the finished article. So going back to Kevin referring to, I'm incredibly worried about the number of women in prison and the knock-on effect in families. And as Kevin says, most of these women a lot of them have addiction problems. The majority have been domestically abused, sexually abused, or have mental health. So last week we had Kirsten Horsburgh here from the Scottish Drugs Forum, and she said she didn't think prison was the place for people with addiction problems, and I agree with her. And she also said there is definitely an argument for decriminalising drugs. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on her views on it, and see whether we can try and reach a consensus of how. I mean, clearly the status quo is not working, so we do need to have a radical shift. So can maybe, Sarah, would you like to
I mean, we wouldn't, from our sort of area of expertise, comment on whether drugs should be decriminalised, but we're definitely, as I've sort of set out, you know, imprisonment, it fractures families, the impacts are huge. So we feel it should be reserved for those who pose the highest risk. As you said there, with women, we have particular concerns there as well. With mothers, there's even greater impacts on children. Often it results in a change of care arrangement because mum's in prison. So from our perspective, what we do want to see is properly funded community-based measures that would reduce the need to send people to prison for remand, for sentence. It would address the reasons behind their offending more effectively, and it would protect children and families from the harms that imprisonment can bring. What I would also just like to sort of bring in here as well is, I mentioned earlier UNCRC, and it's something that we are still sort of waiting to really see the effects of that coming through in the justice system, because in terms of sentencing, if it is a parent, then we should be looking at the impact on children. We should be looking at child impact assessments. And under UNCRC, what should be happening is actually the default should be that we're looking at community-based measures and that sentences, custodial sentences, are avoided unless it's absolutely necessary. And we're not yet seeing that coming through. So that's something that we're hoping in the case of parents, certainly, that we will start to see that shift and we will start to see that greater use of community-based sentences.
Mm-hmm. And I think intervention is something early intervention would be something everybody agrees on. Anyone else like to comment on whether people with addiction problems should be in prison or not?
Yeah, I would agree with the comment that Kirsten made last week. There's quite a few articles, one of them around this, about the effectiveness of not actually sending people to prison, people with substance misuse issues, and it was called sentenced to treatment. And I really agree with that, because you're not effectively changing anything by sending someone to prison, particularly if you don't have enough recovery approaches in place to be able to change that behaviour. So you're actually disempowering them more. And what you need to do is give them the skills. I mean, at NHS 5, we've got this sort of saying that we've got is increase the skills and lose the pills. And what we're doing is trying to provide trauma-informed approaches, support people to understand why they've behaved in a certain way, why they've been using drugs, why they were trying to numb themselves, so that then they're able to just live life without substances. And I think it's the same for individuals who have perhaps threatened social safety, but the reason behind it is the use of drugs. Yeah. So I would totally agree that, it's not the right place for people with substance use problems.
Yeah. And as Sarah's articulated, the knock-on effect to children causes even more harm than the original problem. Anyone else? Tracy, do you want to?
I'll come in, sorry. If that's all right. Yeah. So I do agree with Kirsten as well. Having an addiction and then being in prison when there is no enough support for addictions. Trauma is it's not an excuse for behaviour, but it is an explanation. And that's what we don't get to the root of. We look at the addiction, we look at the behaviour, but we don't look at the pain, and we don't look at the explanation as why. What therapeutic support is in prison available for those in addiction? Again, it's punishment. It's punitive measures.
It's almost been like punished for having an illness.
It is an illness. It is an illness. And you're punishing those, again, who's been punished their whole life. You're not offering a therapeutic, holistic solution that could save this individual's life. All we're doing is causing more harm. And again, having more drugs readily available in prison than out in the community.
Okay, thanks. Tracy?
Yeah, just very quickly. So I think, Ms Dowie, you'd mentioned this last week, that there is no victimless crimes in relation to whether it's a shop theft or whether it's something more serious. I don't think anybody in this panel would say that we would want people at risk in our communities that are really high risk. But what we do know, and the impact particularly around women, is breaking them away from their families, their children, the knock-on effect that has in broader, bigger systems and the money that causes. And if we don't have the support in prison, and we don't support them to look at the elements of their life that could help them change their behaviour, we're actually creating more victims when they come out. And I think there's a bigger, broader point, because I think as a society we need to ask ourselves the questions, why do we think it's okay that we keep putting people in prison that have got low-level drug and alcohol offences? And I think there's a bigger question for me, is that most of the people that we work with, engage with, have been let down by the system from a very young age. Mm-hmm. So let's not go back to history and 25 years ago, but I think there's that acknowledgement that actually a lot of the people we work with, engage with, have been through the care system, have been let down as we went through those systems. That's what we need to try and break. So I would suggest we keep prison for the most high-risk prisoners, and we really, as a society, think about supporting people to reduce that offending behaviour, therefore creating less victims overall.
Yeah, thank you.
Just to bring your attention, see in the 1930s, there was guys appearing in court in America for drink offences. And sheriffs were sending them to Alcoholics Anonymous for 90 days as punishment, right? And what happened to that is hundreds of people got sober out of that. And that's why the fellowships used the 90 meetings in 90 days. They adopted it because sheriffs took it upon them. So we had courts, drug courts, to deal with people with drug issues, and dealt with that. You know, I think it's 57, there might be more than £57,000 a year to keep somebody in prison with untreated trauma, and then releasing them with even more trauma, where if we actually looked at a solution to where, how can we help that person, how can we do that? You know, same with domestic violence, they put people in prison for domestic violence, they put bail orders to stay away from the person that they love, but they've just domestic violence, and it's never treated. And it's an emotional thing for men. I'll just talk about men because it's predominantly men with domestic violence. But I'm using that for an example because it's all behaviour. It's all behaviour, and that behaviour needs addressed, it needs looked at, it needs to change. You know, so with the courts in the 30s in America were doing amazing stuff. They adopted into the fellowships, and you think the day, what are we now doing something different for, based on like drug courts, for instance, to deal with people who are got crimes in the streets. It says, you know, society needs protected for the most dangerous people, and that's why we have prisons for that. You know, but the day the prisons are housing more drug addiction and mental health and what they're criminals.
Okay, thanks. I'm conscious of time, Convener.
Very grateful. Katie Clark.
And I'm wanting to ask about drugs deaths in prisons. And as we all know, Scotland has the highest levels of drugs deaths in Europe across society, but deaths from drugs are increasing in prisons and faster than deaths from other causes. So I wondered if the panel could maybe explain what they believe the reasons are for this and what is being done to address this, and what further we could maybe do to address this issue. I don't know who would like to go first.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. What we're seeing in society is also happening in prisons, but it's to a greater degree. What we're seeing is a number of issues. It was mentioned earlier that it used to be heroin and opioids that was the main problem. It's still in existence, but we're also seeing more stimulant use now. So the most recent one that has been reported is called monkey dust in prison, which is a synthetic stimulant, very potent. And from reports from patients, they tell us that it's knocked them out completely, or it scared them. It's caused them to be more violent, and or else there have been more deaths. So there's a combination of substances, of more potent substances that are on the market at the moment that are causing more harm. The other aspect is the forever challenge of trying to reduce access to substances in prisons. And we know that there's a number of innovative ways that people use to get drugs in prisons. But one of the things that is quite common is the situation with drones. So we know that, drones are dropping substances, and I believe this is law in England, but not yet in Scotland, so I would say, you know, something needs to be done around that to reduce the access as much as possible. But in parallel, it's not just about reducing access. In parallel, we know that treatment and recovery and harm reduction works. So if we invest in actually implementing the medication-assisted treatment standards within prisons in the same equitable way that they've been implemented across the rest of Scotland, then I think you start seeing changes happening. You potentially start seeing less deaths. The issue around the market, what's around in the market, is quite tricky to manage because there's quite a lot of potent substances out there just now.
And before another member of the panel comes in, to what extent are medical assisted treatment, to what extent is that actually being implemented across the prison estate?
It's not being implemented enough.
Not at all, would you say? Or
I wouldn't say
is there
at
some
all.
pockets of...
There's pockets of it, but it's not enough. It needs to be implemented properly. It needs to be measured. I mentioned issues around measurement earlier, you know, around the group of recovery officers with just 3 people. It's not in numbers, it's in quality. So the medication-assisted treatment standards, the way you measure them is you're also asking for people with lived and living experience to give you feedback on what's working. We need that. We need to include that as part of our measures.
Okay, thank you.
Just very quickly. So there is some risk factors in relation to drug-related deaths. So you have your mental health, you have death of a loved one while in prison. Planned transfers has come up as a risk factor in relation to drug-related deaths that's come out in the evidence base that I've looked at, lack of family support, drug use. So there's a range of different elements in this that I think we need to be cautious of. What I've also seen in terms of the evidence base and the needs assessments that I've looked at is people may be using one substance in the community and that's not available in prison. They will use other substances. They will use what's available, and there's data to bear that out. If the committee needs that, I'm happy to send on the links. That increases the risk. I think Kirsten mentioned it last week in relation to the committee, in relation to no understanding the dose, etc. In relation to that. One of the things we need to do around drug-related deaths is learn from drug-related deaths. That goes into the realms of fatal accident inquiries and what all that looks like, and I know the committee are looking at that, and I know the CABSEC is progressing that in relation to fatal accident inquiries, etc. There is a broader question for me around drug-related deaths. I connect into alcohol and drugs partnerships. It's really difficult to get toxicology. If you're waiting 18 months for toxicology to understand who someone had in their system when they die, and that doesn't come to a drug-related death review group until you get that toxicology, it's hard to respond 18 months later. So there's some questions around that toxicology process more broadly. In relation to the MAT standards, caution. The MAT standards, we need them. We need all the elements of that: harm reduction, naloxone, treatment, residential rehab. But what we know about what's happened in the community is we have heavily focused on a medical model, which has had a negative impact on all the other things that you need to keep people in recovery, housing, homelessness, recovery communities, all family connections, bonds, relationship, all those things. The MAT standards in prisons, the word of caution, can we please make sure when we implement the MAT standards we don't just look at the medication, that we look at everything else that needs wrapped around. And that would be a real plea for me, because we're seeing real impacts on small grassroots organisations because actually we're so heavily focused on a medical model. So that would just be a word of caution, and keeping lived experience at the heart of all this. Talk to the people who are in it. They'll tell you what the solutions are.
I'm going to ask about fatal accident inquiries, but before we focus on that, do any of the other members of the panel have anything to add in terms of why we've got such high levels in Scotland?
I'll come in. I think just the ready available drugs that we have, it's rife throughout Scottish prisons just now. Also, does the individual know what they are taking when they are taking it at the time? It could be used in vapes, and if they're being passed in vapes, they might not know what they're actually smoking. Synthetic substances, if an individual is in psychosis as well, that has a massive impact on their mental illness, on their behaviours. And again, it just comes back for me as the reasons why. Why is the individual using drugs in prison? And if we get to the why, then we can get to the solution.
Thank you.
I just A question I've been asking for years. They cringe when I ask the question, because the drug deaths in the kind of age group is between 35 and 55 at the age. I'm sure they say that the highest number of people who die in extremely prisons, and you know, these are drug-related deaths, unintentional. But how many were intentional? How many were death by way of suicide? It's never looked at. Yet you see experienced drug addicts, people who know how to use drugs, been using them for years, and they don't like me going near that question. They don't like to ask that question, but nobody seems to go in and ask, how is he? How was she a week before? How were they? How was their behaviour? Because they can check, but that again is stuff that's not collected, it's not looked at. You know, and when you're caught between a rock and a hard place, it's between ages of 35 and 55, and you see no hope or any opportunity, yeah, that's an option people may take. But because it's paraphernalia for them, it's a drug-related death. But when you've got levels of mental health on top of that, you know, people avoid it because they don't like to hear it, because it then becomes another issue. But actually, they need to look at it, and that's another reason why I think there could be you know, the spike. Again, you've got to remember Scotland's a very small populated country compared to England. We probably get a lot more drugs coming into this country per population than what England get. That's why they don't have the same problem. We're consuming a lot more. And that's why it's more readily available, and this is why we've got that higher risky overdose, unintentional overdose. You know, that unintentional overdose, when it goes down to England, which is more populated than Scotland, and the drugs are coming in, it needs to get broken down so they can distribute it. I don't think it gets broken down as much up here in Scotland because of the population, so that's the numbers as well. That's my theory behind it, you know.
Okay, thank you. So, we've obviously had quite a number of fatal accident inquiries. Do you think the experiences of fatal accident inquiries following a death in custody have improved since the independent review of the response to deaths in prison custody, particularly for families? And are we learning the lessons from the fatal accident inquiries that have taken place?
I would say no. This infuriates me. Suicides in custody. I last attended Talk to Me training in 2021. Now, on that training, I was told that there was a 40% increase in suicides in prisons. 40%. How did that get to that number? Now, that is not only a number, but it is individuals' lives. It is a mum losing her son, losing her daughter, a child losing their father. And looking at this Justice Secretary's statement from the 27th of March 2025. So it says SPS will overhaul their strategy in tandem with the evidence review, so it will be ready to publish at the end of this year. So we're collecting evidence with a full training package to be implemented in 2026. So what has happened from 2021 till 2026? Where is adequate training for suicide prevention in Scottish prisons, and how many more have we lost to suicide? I think it's disgraceful. I think we've failed the men and women in our care. I actually myself, after that day, I know Tracy and my CEO Natalie have been speaking about this for years. Not just drug deaths, but suicides, and nothing has been changed. So I decided on that day to write a play and a film about suicide and addiction, because sometimes talking about it is just not enough. So I've had to show this through experience and use the men in the prison to act in a play to give them a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. But really, I'm doing it for the change in society, because I have had enough, and that 40% should have never gotten to that number.
So do any of the panel have an explanation as to why the necessary action has not been taken?
I wouldn't want to speak for SPS, but I would imagine it's resource, capacity, recruitment, staff and leadership to put it into practice and implement it. But again, I cannot speak on behalf of SPS.
But you've already said that there is significant resource across the sector. So, I mean, it's how that resource is used as well, isn't it?
Yeah. It's about the strategic priorities of any organisation to keep the people that they care for safe. And that's basic human rights. I mean, the Scottish Welfare Commission and Human Rights have done a huge amount of work in the prisons. And actually, there's another report with 25 recommendations and only 3 have been met. And that's been out since 2023. So this is down to organisational strategic leadership and organisational priorities. We're back to the same discussion that we had about what value do we place in people in our prisons.
So is the panel saying that it's not been given enough priority?
If there's a 42% increase in suicides, I would suggest that there's a bit of an emergency happening within our prison estate that we've not really got a handle on. Understanding all the complexities, because I watched the panel last week and I understand what Susie was saying in terms of staff and resource. I completely get it, but... Yeah.
Some people today are residents in jails are still living under the COVID rules. There's still 23 hours a day, dub up, nothing happening, programmes not happening. You know, whether the SPS has used that, I don't know what goes on, but, you know, the staff of people being redeployed to do other things, staff members being redeployed to do other roles and not delivering programmes and stuff like that. So when you're locked up for 23 hours a day and looking at the drug deaths and, or even the levels of suicide, you can see that it drives people insane to be locked up 23 hours a day. If you're on your own, or if you've got somebody else in with you, and you've got to try and build a relationship with them, if what goes on, you know what I mean? It's difficult being there. But I believe that the prisons haven't opened up like the country has opened up after COVID. I believe that's playing a factor right now.
Ms. Clark, can I just add very quickly? So there's a range of policy directives that everybody's moving towards, but what's happened over the last probably few months is the energy and commitment that we've had to make in terms of early release. So I am sure our SPS colleagues, our colleagues in justice, our colleagues in criminal justice, social work are working. We're working locally. We then need to move our focus away from the work that we should be driving forward to then focus on early release. That's twice that's happened. So I can imagine across third sector, community justice, services, prison, NHS, we're moving in a direction and then our focus has to shift because we've had to focus on the early release process and that's a huge amount. And we've seen that at Criminal Justice Board level, at Scottish Government level, where we've had to shift our priorities because something else has had to be dealt with straight away. That doesn't help because that takes our energy away from the day-to-day work that we should be doing to help people in prison. Does that make sense?
So it's something to do with the culture as well. So, you know, I like to call it, if you want to bring order, you could provide compassionate order. And I think we're lacking compassion in our prisons. Somebody mentioned something about the value of lives in prison. And we're not valuing lives in prison. We can do it with compassion. And none of us get up in the morning trying to upset others. But I think if you don't know how to do it, if you don't know how to keep order in the right way, if you're not haven't got the right skill, you end up using harsh approaches which do not help, which re-traumatize people. So I think, yes, to answer your question, we've not given it enough priority. We've not looked enough at what are the drivers of the increased deaths in prisons. And although we've got some evidence of, you know, by looking at the FAIs, what are we doing about them? Once again, it's that implementation aspect, the what if.
Yes.
What if we did this?
Thank you.
Sorry, can I?
Of course.
It's hopefully sort of looking ahead that it's looking maybe slightly more positive, because we've obviously been really concerned in the length of time that's passed and that the recommendations progress have been really slow. But obviously, since the start of this year, we have seen announcements from the Cabinet Secretary. So one of the main ones, from our perspective, provision of non-means tested legal aid for bereaved families in terms of FAIs. She's also announced an additional support service for families and a new family advocacy role. So all of these things are things that we have been looking for to happen. But we're obviously in the very early stages. We're waiting to now see them being actioned and implemented. But they all have the potential, I think, to make a real difference for families' experiences when there's been a bereavement in custody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Finally, a very quick question, which I'll just throw back to Professor Gallius-Singer, based on something that you said earlier. The SPS recovery strategy says that the medication-assisted treatment, the MAT standards, will be fully implemented by April 2026. Based on your answer earlier, is that going to be hit?
Yeah, it's definitely not going to happen, I would say, just being blunt about it. I think if you want to make it happen, then you need to really put more investment in it. And investment, I'm not just thinking financially, but how can you work differently in order to implement the medication-assisted treatment standards? The other thing I want to mention about them is, because I know, Tracy, apologies, but you said it's a medical model. I actually don't think so, because if you look at MAT standard 6 and 10, they're about trauma-informed care. There's, you know, with every MAT standard, there's a need to ask for lived and living experience feedback. So there's a lot of, there's recovery, there's harm reduction. MAT standard 4 is about harm reduction. And that's another thing that we didn't have the time to approach today. It's to do with needle exchange in prisons. You know, we don't actually do much of that in Scotland. In fact, I'm not sure it's done at all. But you've got international examples in Spain and Switzerland, I think, where they've had real success rates with. So if we're wanting to implement the medication-assisted treatment standards, we need to look at all these aspects, learn from international and local initiatives, and just, once again, I keep saying the same thing, implementation plan, you know, with smart timelines on making it happen. So I think it's a little bit unrealistic, the April 2026. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for what has been a very interesting and informative session for us this morning. I think it will be extremely helpful to us going forward as we shape our inquiry. What I would ask, sometimes throughout the session, for example, Tracy McFaul offered to send on some data. This committee loves data. If you've got something that we'd be interested in, please do send it on. And I make the same. Gemma, you talked very interestingly about the play that I think you wrote, and I'm sure we'd value more details on that if they were to be sent in.
So I'll send you a link.
That's now on the public record. So at our next meeting on Wednesday, 11th of June, we'll consider an affirmative SSI on home detention curfew licences. We'll consider a negative SSI on firefighters' pensions. And we'll begin stage 2 proceedings on the Criminal Justice Modernisation and Abusive Domestic Behaviour Reviews Scotland Bill. And members may wish to recall that the deadline to lodge amendments for stage 2 of that bill is noon tomorrow. So with that, we will move into private session. Thank you again. Have a great day.